A Primer on Twisting Light, a Light Twister Guide by Michael Richards. For all the masochists who really want to understand an unnecessarily complicated magic system. Forward. An introduction for those not raised among Light Twister communities, such as those from the hinterlands, across the Great Gorge, the backwater islands, the many plains, and so forth. Dear reader, I'm thrilled to offer this humble primer on the art of twisting light to help you better appreciate this marvelous world we live in, and prepare you for a future of wonder and enchantment. Let me be among the first to welcome you as the newest members to Freysdal, the most powerful and compassionate order of light twisters. Such fantastic information awaits you. I'm a little jealous that you get to hear it all for the first time. I remember well the sense of excitement that quickened my heart as I sat at the feet of my mentor, learning from him how to manipulate that ethereal substance, radiant energy. I will endeavor to take a subject that is complicated and make it comprehensible. In one sense, this will be easy. The complexity of this subject does not lie in difficult ideas or deep concepts. In another sense, however, it can be challenging. The interconnectedness of each aspect of light twisting means that at every step some information will be left out. When it's finally presented, the reader may ask, why was this not explained earlier? Failing to realize that not everything can be presented at once. I'll attempt to minimize this experience as much as possible, but will ask for your indulgence when it is unavoidable. We begin with a review of some of the wonders of our world that arise from radiance. Following that, we'll discuss exactly what radiance is, what it means to be a light twister, and how light twistings work. Where appropriate, I'll introduce small portions of well-known light twister history to help facilitate your assimilation into our community. Finally, at the end of this primer, I've included a glossary with pronunciation for words that are uncommon or maybe unfamiliar to some of you. As you progress along this journey, you'll encounter challenges, sometimes severe. Please don't get discouraged. You have been given one of the greatest gifts that the gods can bestow upon mortals. Cherish it and use it to enrich the lives of those around you. Sincerely, Marcus Aurelius. Introduction. Thadrin is a land overflowing with wonder. Most of its inhabitants, however, only ever hear stories about a small section of the marvels it contains, and only ever see an even smaller part. I remember as a child hearing stories about fabled Storm Lake, where great boulders of ice float within a boiling pool beneath an ever-raging cyclone. I knew such a place could not exist, but I loved the stories. When I learned I could twist light and joined Freysdal, I was shocked to discover that not only does Storm Lake exist, but many other impossible places and incredible creatures do as well. Of course, I also learned some stories, like the one about visitors from and to other worlds, or one about the long night where the sun did not rise, were not true. You have heard several stories, and like me, may have thought they were mere tales, but many of them are true. As a light twister, if you're brave and powerful enough, you may get to see many of them yourself. Your appreciation for the wonders of this land will surpass that of any non-light twister. Maybe you've heard stories about the fire-breathing dragons of the northern desert, or the shelled dragons of the colossal forest. The six-legged ice dragons may have been part of your Loyendel celebrations, or the giant worms of the gorge may have haunted your dreams. You've heard of such creatures, but did you know that each one depends on radiance for its survival? The dragons, for example, all use radiance in their hunting. The giants of the world, worms, cats, apes, and more, exist solely because of radiance. If radiance did not exist, much of this world's beauty would not exist either. The moonbeam blossoms, with their faint luminance, would be no different from the daisy if there were no radiance. Without radiance, the equatorial ice plains would be as hot as the surrounding jungles. The creeping vines of Atarak Island would be as still as other plants, and the molten pools of Grantel Range would be just one more mountain peak. Radiance brings wonder to our world, but what exactly is it? Basics of radiance and sources. Radiance is the word we use to describe the energy that emanates from sources. A source is anything that gives off or radiates energy. There are 5 types of radiant energy: igniferous, cryogenous, viaticus, luminous, and biosis, or as they are more commonly called, heat, cold, force, light, and bio. At one time, life was also used for bio, but this has become less and less common because it has inspired too many young light twisters to try to reanimate the dead. This, of course, is impossible. As an additional aside, before I continue, there have been many past efforts to associate each of the energies with one god or another. Hust with bio, for example, or Heldig with light. However, in most religious texts, twisting light is either spurned as wicked or simply ignored. So there seems to be no real relation between the gods and the various sources. Sources are identified by the dominant energy they radiate. I write dominant because all sources give off mixtures of energies. It's only in fantastical worlds created by simple minds where you read about light twisters with pure sources. Such sources do not exist. But powerful sources that are predominantly one kind of energy can be found, if you search diligently or have something else of value to give in exchange. So, what is this energy? Well, that's hard to answer. One way to describe it is a quantity with the capacity to produce an effect. Now, I know that's not satisfying, but it does work. Let's examine each piece. A quantity tells us that whatever radiant energy is, it can be measured. You can have more or less of it. Tied closely to quantity, energy also has a density. That is, if I have 1 unit of heat energy, and I squeeze it down to the size of a pea, it will be very dense compared to if I spread it out to the size of a room. And while the total amount of energy is the same in both cases, the effects they can produce will be drastically different. If, for example, I were to drop the very dense, pea-sized quantity of heat into a pebble and release it quickly, the pebble would explode with a loud pop, and tiny pebble dust would pepper the surroundings. If I released the same single unit of heat after allowing it to spread out to fill a whole room, the effect would be too subtle to even notice. This brings up 2 critical points. The first is that energy is not the thing for which it has the capacity. Confusing? Heat energy is not heat. It is just the capacity, or ability, to make things hot. As a light twister, as long as I hold the heat energy, nothing will get hot. Once I release it, though, the temperature of whatever I've released it into will increase. This leads us to the second point. Non-light twisters do not sense sources like we do. If you thought heat energy was heat, then you would expect heat sources to be hot, and you would think that everyone should be able to identify them. However, sources radiate energy, and that energy doesn't manifest its potential effects until it is released. A light twister can release energy at any time after they have taken hold of it, In nature, though, energy travels great distances before it is naturally released, which explains why non-light twisters can't detect sources. Picture this. There is a light source sitting in a field. The light energy radiating from that source travels out in an ever-expanding sphere from the source. Most of the energy persists for a long time in air, so the energy might travel a mile or more before it actually becomes light. If you had a lump of bread dough, and you rolled it out so thin that it could cover a hill that was a mile wide and a mile tall, how thick would that dough be? Over 1,000 times thinner than a strand of hair. Energy radiating naturally works the same way, and that's why non-light twisters fail to perceive sources. The energy is just too dilute by the time it gets converted into actual light. But what if there were hundreds or thousands of light sources all sitting in a field? The total light energy coming from those sources might create enough light for a non-light twister to see it. Now, imagine if I had millions or even billions of small, weak sources spread throughout an area. Individually, no single source would emit enough light to be perceptible to non-light twisters. But collectively, they could dramatically affect the surroundings. This is exactly what we find in many places throughout Thadrin. If you walk from Vladisobak to the northernmost point of Thadrin in the winter, you'll experience some peculiar things. The days will get shorter, and at first, the temperature will get colder. Not far outside the city, you'll soon feel the solid, frozen soil beneath your feet and see land too cold for more than the hardiest grasses to survive. You'll see all that, unless, of course, it's covered in snow. With each breath in, the snot in your nose will freeze before rethawing with a misty breath out. The cold will be so intense you'll have to start using your heat sources to keep yourself from freezing at night. Then, just as you reach the point where the sun no longer makes it above the horizon, and each day is 6 hours of gloomy wintry dusk, the snow beneath your cold numb feet will become a solid sheet of ice, and alternating gusts of warm and frigid air will leave you comfortable one moment and freezing the next. The further north you go, the more frequent the hot air and the thinner the ice until it begins to crack beneath your feet, and you find your boots mired in fetid mud. Pressing forward, your legs will grow weary with each sucking, squelching step, and you'll slow as you place each foot down carefully, seeking firmer footing. Darkness will prevail at all hours by this point, but in your torchlight you will see pale-colored grasses sprouting again from the land, at first in patches and then in vast, meadow-like expanses. You'll likely pause, after realizing it's been several hundred feet since you last sank into mud, and you'll clean your boots off, wishing your nostrils were still frozen as you do so. Then you will shed your coat, as sweat rolls down your back, despite a cool breeze. You will feel the warmth of the sun shining on your face, but all you will see is empty darkness punctuated by twinkling stars and the occasionally dancing nightlights. That is, if you are fortunate enough to travel when there are no storms raging. We will ignore, for now, the inhabitants of this region, who will almost certainly accost you if you stray from the common path, and instead focus your attention on the increased foliage as bushes and the occasional copse of trees appear. However, as you continue north, the trees will thin, then disappear. The bushes will become smaller and smaller until they too vanish. Soon, even the grass will be withered, then patchy, then gone altogether. You will have shed all your external clothes by this point, but you will wish for a sheet to hold in front of yourself as you press forward in the darkness towards what feels like the open door of a great furnace. Sweat will accumulate between your back and your bag and roll down your exposed legs, but the hot wind will dry it before it reaches your ankles. The stars overhead and directly in front of you will shimmer in the swirling heat of the baking desert through which you traverse. If you're lucky, you will not encounter any of the beasts that roam this desert. They are always hungry, and a morsel as tender and juicy as you would make for a welcome meal. Off in the distance, you'll be beckoned by a gyrating beacon of light that seems to rise from the desert floor in the darkness. Soon, though, unless you've carried sources with sufficient cold in them, you will be forced to stop because the heat will be unbearable. You will, of course, know why, because you're a light twister. You will have noticed, as the ice began to thin, and the grasses, bushes, and trees appeared and then disappeared, that the soil contained the tiniest amount of heat source. By itself, it is without effect. But together, spread across hundreds of miles, it releases enough heat to push back the frozen waste and allow a strip of life before becoming an unbearable inferno in the center. If you did bring enough cold with you, you might chance braving to that center, where a swirling conflagration of heat ever ascends to the heavens. It's beautiful to see the undulating golden light that shines into the darkness from the glowing hot air. But take care that you maintain a sufficiently wide bubble of cold about yourself. Many light twisters have not, and have then failed to notice when their clothes, whipped about by the hurricane-strength incandescently hot winds, slipped out of the cold and caught fire. A single moment of distraction in a place so hostile to life is all that's needed for an awesome sight to become a dreadful demise. And underlying the beauty and dread of it all will be the undiminished frustration that you are surrounded by more heat source than 1,000,000 streaming light twisters could use in 1,000,000 years, but not a grain of it is worth carrying out with you. Let's return to the topic at hand. We know what sources are. We have an idea what energy is. I've assumed you understood that light twisters can control radiant energy, and non-light twisters cannot. If that wasn't clear before, consider yourself informed now. I've also explained why non-light twisters cannot actually detect sources. We'll now briefly discuss the effects of the different energies. It should be obvious what light, heat, and cold do. When released, they shine, increase the temperature, or lower the temperature. As a side note here, most people who study this sort of thing believe that the appellation light twister came about for one or more of the following reasons. Light is the only effect that non-light twisters can see directly. Light is the most abundant of the sources. And most light twisters have an affinity for light. More on this later. But what do force and bio do? Let's look at bio first. If I released some bio in the air in front of you, you'd probably feel a wave of well-being flow across you. It wouldn't be clear to you, but that feeling was your body responding to a gentle invitation from the energy to grow. Bio invites living things to grow. If you drop some bioenergy into stone, nothing will happen. If you drop some onto something living, it will bulge before your eyes. Properly used, bio can accelerate growth, but it is a tricky business, and one where mistakes can be catastrophic. Force is even more peculiar, and it's very difficult for people to understand unless they experience it firsthand. I'll try my best to explain it to you, but you might have to read this a few times, or just go find a light twister and have them demonstrate it for you. Force is used to push things. So, if I drop some force into a stone, the stone will shoot off like it had been kicked. But which direction will it shoot off in? This is where the confusion with force comes in. In addition to the normal features the other energies have, density and quantity, force also has a direction, which we refer to as a vector. If I were to drop some force into a stone, I could make the vector point up or down, forward or backward, or any direction I want. When I release the force, the stone will move in that direction. But a quantity of force doesn't just have a single vector. It has innumerable little vectors, and I don't need to make them all point in the same direction. I could make half of them point left and half point right. If I released some force with vectors oriented like that within the stone would just sit there, because the force pointing to the left would cancel out the force pointing to the right. If, however, I put that same force pointing in two opposite directions into an apple, and then released it, the apple would tear itself in half, and each half would fly in the opposite direction. If I did the same thing, but made all the vectors point outward, the apple would explode in all different directions. If I oriented all the vectors inward, the apple would get all mashed together. The vectors of force energy radiating from most natural sources point in random directions. When released, all the tiny pushes from the force counteract each other, and the energy doesn't cause any effect. Some sources, though, produce force with most of the vectors aligned, so they do have an effect. If you're able to keep track of everything I've explained, you can imagine how the aerolith basin, with its great floating stones, might exist. This brings us to another valuable point about sources. Not all sources are created equally. Just as there are sources that produce force with vectors aligned and others with random vectors, there are sources that produce light of higher quality, brighter, and light of lesser quality, not as bright. The differences are fairly small, but they are detectable. In fact, a single source might radiate several different qualities of the same kind of energy. That is, your light source might give off a mix of light energies that, when released, produce light of varying strengths. The greatest challenge most light twisters face is finding and keeping strong sources. Contrary to non-light twister conventional wisdom, the source trail is not just a card game that requires strategy and cunning to win, but is an actual route that, if followed, will lead to powerful sources. It is, however, extremely hazardous, not only because of the great monsters who haunt its lengths, but because of the other light twisters who know it is often easier to take a powerful source from a distracted light twister than to find one and get one from a fully developed dragon. This is a good place to stop and shift our attention to light twisters. Before we do, let's recap what we've covered so far. Sources are things that radiate energy. Energy is a quantity with a capacity to do something. Radiant energy comes in 5 different varieties: heat, cold, light, force, and bio. Light twisters can detect and control radiant energy directly. Non-light twisters cannot control radiant energy, and they can only detect the effects of radiant energy when those effects are strong enough. Radiant energy has a density that influences the results it can produce, and a quality that says how intense its effects are. Light twisters. No one knows for certain why some people can twist light while others cannot. It tends to run in families, but only one in maybe 100 cousins will have the ability. Sometimes it might skip a generation or two. Strong light twisters are more likely to have children who can also twist light. Certain regions of Thadrin also tend to have more light twisters, while others have none. Most of you discovered you could twist light when you started to sense sources. Whether you began to feel textures that no one else could feel, or hear sounds that no one else could hear, or if you started seeing things that no one else could, somehow you realized you could detect things that were undetectable to others. There are apocryphal stories of people who can sense, but cannot manipulate energy. I've never personally known any, but I hope none of you are like that. Regardless of how you started sensing sources, eventually all light twisters come to describe the experience as a radiant sight. This is because sight most closely matches the experience. You can sense sources and energy from a distance. You can differentiate between types of energy, which most usually eventually interpret as color and texture. You can distinguish between shapes, and you can see reflections of energy off of other objects. A very small portion of you might have first discovered your nature when you noticed that you had split streams of consciousness, that you could focus on and think about more than one thing at a time. And It occurs to me that I've been rude in not addressing you all first, because you have been identified as light twisters, but can't yet detect sources. You probably feel like a blind girl, listening to everyone else exclaim at the beauty of the flowers or the grand view. Let me do my best to explain to you what everything looks like. So when your radiant sight comes, and trust me, it will, you won't be too lost. Once your radiant light comes, you can't stop seeing it. There are no radiant eyes to close. That sight will be permanent, and while it can grow accustomed to the things it detects, like you stop noticing the feel of a seat beneath you after sitting for a while, it actually never goes away. Let me repeat that while it isn't actually sight like you have with your eyes, your minds will overlay the two sensory experiences so that you will see sources and energy precisely where they are in relation to everything else you see with your eyes. Sources appear to the radiant sight as, well, sources of light. They might look like a weak glow, a twinkling star, a flickering flame, a raging fire, or a blazing piece of the sun, all depending on how strong they are, how sensitive you are, and what materials they travel through to reach you. Energy travels very far through air, but not as far through solid things. Different sources will appear to be different colors. While the color-to-energy type is not consistent across light twisters, I see heat as red, light as yellow, bio as green, cold as blue, and force as gray, for example. There doesn't appear to be any reason or impact for this inconsistency. Of course, all true sources produce mixtures of different energies, and so frequently sources just look like a shining, muddy, brownish color. You cannot see a light twister's mind as it collects energy from a source, but you can see the energy that it is collecting. The mind essentially works by denoting areas through which energy cannot go, just like a box or a bucket does to grain or water. So, just try to imagine watching someone scoop water from a well, but the bucket is invisible, so all you can see is the water. And instead of water, you are actually seeing a swirling, diffuse, semi-transparent gas of colorful glowing energy. Well, at least you get the idea, even if the example isn't terribly helpful. Many light twistings require specific shapes, and these are just the minds laying out the boundaries within which the energy can move. So, when shaped like a cube, the luminescent energy will fill into the edges of the cube. When shaped like a flat sheet, the energy will spread. When shaped like a helix, the energy will twirl upward and downward. When two or more energies are held in the same physical space, they tend to mix, but their colors don't blend as much as they do coming out of the source. Rather, they gain a marbled appearance, with streaks of one energy within the other. So, what you see is two or more different colored gases swirling and moving about within the confines of the minds. It takes some effort to get energy to spread uniformly within another energy. Usually, the uniformity is not important, but sometimes it is. As we'll talk about more later, it is very common when twisting light to release one form of energy within another to produce profoundly different effects than either of the original energies could. When one energy is released within another, a variety of interesting visual phenomena occur. Sometimes one energy just gets absorbed into the other, and the colors blend. Other times, the released energy can take on interesting geometric patterns or structures within the confines of the mind. The released energy might shift from a gaseous appearance to a gel or a solid, or it might stay a gas but shift in color or translucence. This is one of the most fascinating things to observe, and I really can't do it justice. But, as I said, never fear. It won't be long before you can observe it for yourself. A final interesting feature of radiant sight is the reflection you'll see of sources from their surroundings. Even in pitch black, if there is a source, you'll see faint outlines of the objects around it. If it's a powerful source, you might be able to see things as well as you can in moonlight, if moonlight were the random assortment of colors that sources produce. Back to the topic of multiple streams of consciousness. For most new light twister trainees, this is the most shocking and sometimes disturbing change that they endure as they become a light twister. We'll cover it now, so you can begin to watch for it and, if possible, avoid feeling too disturbed, or worse, think that you have gone mad when it begins to happen. As a side note, Most authors have adopted the term minds because it's easier to write, in place of streams of consciousness or streams of thought, though it is a less proper term. I will use all three, but will tend towards minds. As a light twister, you will develop multiple streams of consciousness, or minds. You will be able to think of multiple things, take multiple actions, and control several quantities of energy simultaneously. At first, you may feel like you are just talking to yourself, but yourself will answer as if it is you while still being distinct from you. Don't be afraid. Both minds are you. Struggling for control over what you consider to be the real you will only lead to frustration. And, as with any other part of your body, the more you use your streams of thought, the stronger they will become. However, unlike other parts of your body, the more you use your minds, the more minds you will develop. Can you imagine if the more you used your fingers, the more of them you would grow? Streams of consciousness can specialize by repeatedly performing the same task, and they sometimes develop unique traits like increased creativity, heightened emotional sensitivity, or rigorous logic. But be careful. New minds come with predispositions, and frequently they are predisposed to darkness. Light twisters who do not steer their minds toward good are largely responsible for the bad reputation we have in many parts of the world. When a new mind presents itself, be sure to give it uplifting tasks, and use your more developed minds to lead it towards good. If you give in to the impulses of the younger, usually more selfish and vicious minds, the older minds will eventually follow, regardless of how good they are to start with. Each mind will eventually become what you allow it to be. You, the fundamental, essential thing that is you, direct all your streams of consciousness, but you do not necessarily control them. So, be sure to direct well. When all else fails, you can shut down minds until you have the time and capacity to deal with them. This is much easier with newer, less developed minds. So, if you find a mind veering towards darkness, shut it down until other minds are strong enough to guide it back. The rate at which new minds appear is initially slow. At some point, it will rapidly increase for a period of about a year, and then it will finally slow down as you age. A typical mature light twister might have around 100 minds, and a powerful one might have 300. Each mind can control one quantity of energy at a time. So, if you wished to do a light twisting that requires 6 quantities of light and 3 quantities of force, you would need 9 minds. Ideally, you'd have a 10th, so one can steer the others. There are different theories about mind development and control. Some light twisters prefer to specialize each mind, giving them the same tasks with the same energy over and over. Others prefer well-rounded minds that can perform all tasks equally well. As with so much of life, each side of this disagreement has strong points in its favor, but when arguments fail to convince, some turn to violence. Duels have long been the solution to arguments that couldn't be settled with reason. The numbers and strengths of minds employed are the most important factors in a duel. Next are the levels of knowledge and skill of the contenders. Whether a light twister has specialized or generalized minds has such a small impact on the outcome of a duel that for a long time it was impossible to prove which approach was better. But that didn't stop the two sides from trying. If it weren't for Akilan and Nalika, they'd probably still be fighting about it today. Akilan and Nalika. Akilan and Nalika were remarkable sisters. Born moments apart, they were mirror images of one another. Identical mahogany skin, lush curly hair, and inquisitive eyes. But where Akilan was right-handed, Nalika was a lefty. Akilan's smile quirked to the left, and Nalika's to the right. The two children were fiercely competitive in all aspects of their lives. Akilan spoke her first word, and, upon hearing it, Nalika shouted hers. Nalika took her first step, and Akilan took a step then reached out and pulled Nalika to the ground. At least, that's how their father told the story. As their mother explained it, Aquilon, seeing her sister tottering, reached out to stabilize her, and both lost their balance. You see, in addition to being ultra-competitive, they loved each other more than anything else. Like so many twins, they enjoyed playing pranks on others, frequently impersonating each other to confuse people. Only those who knew their mirrored nature could tell them apart, and, as with other twins, they seemed to have a preternatural ability to communicate with and understand one another that was opaque to those around them. Their mother also reported that they each began to sense sources within moments of each other. But here is where their biggest difference came to light. Nalika first sensed heat, while Aquilon first sensed cold. Both were mentored by Turlane, but where Nalika had an affinity for heat and specialized her minds, Aquilon had an affinity for cold and chose to make her minds generalists. As with all of Turlane's apprentices, the twins spent their first several months in grueling development. Their minds proliferated as they consumed weak source after weak source. Eventually, they became competent enough to seek their own sources, and, in a stroke of bad luck, joined the ill-fated 112th Source Trail Cadre. Their fierce loyalty to each other proved their salvation when jealousy over sources caused infighting within the cadre, and eventually led to duels, treachery, and murder. The twins escaped when the group turned on itself, and, as the only survivors of the cadre, the girls completed the source trail on their own, despite the danger. They returned to Turlane with full sets of powerful, high-purity sources. They also returned with scars from their treacherous journey that made it easy to tell them apart. But, in an act of devotion, though many think it was also madness, they each replicated their sisters' scars on their own bodies. Strengthened by the perils they faced, and invigorated by the constant threat of danger on their journey, the sisters began to lust after risk. They laid out a plan to cross the Great Gorge and explore the lands beyond, confident that they could survive where so many others had died. Their parents, though, fearing for the twins' safety, begged them to reconsider, and eventually prevailed by convincing them to join the dueling conference to sate their thirst for risk. Each joined a club whose style best reflected their own, and soon found themselves pulled deeper into the specialist versus generalist debate. Aquilon further specialized her minds, training each almost exclusively on using one type of energy and very few patterns. Nalika did the opposite, balancing as close to perfectly as she could each mind's exposure to all of the energies and hundreds of patterns. The sisters excelled in dueling and rose in the ranks, frequently defeating light twisters who seemed to have more and stronger minds because of the skills they had each developed. However, both eventually lost in duels against less skilled but more powerful opponents. Everything changed, though, when Fajar developed specialized testing to determine overall raw light twisting power. Suddenly, the twins' success could be put in context. It came as no surprise that they scored identically. What was a surprise, however, was that within their power class they were by far the best. Soon, people began to call for a duel between the two. When they had decided to start dueling, they had agreed that they would never face each other. But suddenly, they were thrust into the center of the debate between the specialists and the generalists. Because they were so evenly matched in raw power, and no one doubted that they had matching skill as well, they were the perfect test case for figuring out whose camp was better. Dueling pits are 1-foot-deep circles, 50 paces across. Karental's official pit is surrounded by seating for 3,000 spectators and open to the sky. The day the two dueled, billowing clouds, heavy with water, cast dark shadows across the land. The thralls, having finished grading the ground of the pit, stood in their sweat-stained, rough-hewn wraps, smelling ripe as 3-week Von fruit, and waited in line at the exit to collect their supper. Hundreds of people from all the strata of Carental's classes filed in, making their way to their seats. Those in deep red or blue robes of silk and brocade, house emblems embroidered on their sleeves or chests, sat in the front, while the artisan light twisters sat in the middle, and the weaker, common light twisters sat in the back. Excited whispers and heads close together, gazes questing out to catch a glimpse of the sisters, bespoke an energy that had been building for years. A pivotal question would be settled that day, if the sky would hold its peace. But, where the furtive glances outward kept the sisters in their alcoves, the scowling glances upward seemed to tempt the gods. It wasn't long after the seats were full that a few great drops of cold rain began to splatter on the audience and darken the smooth dirt of the pit. Loud exclamations of disappointment drowned out the head judge as he stood to cancel the match, much too treacherous to duel in a pit full of mud. With the long train of his black robes draped over his left arm, he raised his right to call for silence. But, as he folded out a light twisting to amplify his voice, something never seen before, though it has happened several times since, took place. Light twisters in the audience drew forth heat and cold from their sources and spanned the whole pit and seating area with a series of overlapping sheets of solid air, like shingles, to form a dome. The judge watched in amazement as panel after panel went into place, and then the light twisters who formed each one continued to funnel energy to it, ensuring it would remain the entire match. It took several minutes, and just as the last panel, a conical cap over the center of the pit, was put in place, buckets of rain began pouring from the sky. Everyone watched, feeling like they were looking up at the bottom of a river, as the rain just stopped falling mid-air and flowed out over the edges of the pit. Several people screamed when lightning struck above the pit, but its branching streaks merely traced the outline of the air dome, even as a loud boom shook the whole assembly. The head judge, hand turned up to catch the rain that wasn't falling, shrugged and went back to his platform. The crowd's applause drowned out the dull drumming of the rain on the air shingles. The saviors, with their bright orange sashes, marched around the circle. The minor judges took their places, and the sisters, representing 2 different philosophies, stepped down into the pit. If it weren't for the bands wrapped around their arms for their dueling clubs, red on Aquilon and green on Nalika, the audience would not have been able to tell the two apart. Each wore the unadorned pale yellow tunic of the duel, cinched at the waist and draping halfway down their dark thighs. Their curly hair was cut short, so it was little more than a shadow around their heads. The raised scars on each leg, arm, and face spoke of repeated contact with danger, and their eyes, narrowed in concentration, let the audience know this was more than sisters testing themselves against each other. For all their similarities, their appearance, their voices, even the smell of potash soap and mint in their hair, for all of these, the sisters could not be more different in how they dueled. Even before the head judge's flash of light dissipated, Aquilon came out striking hard, hurling complex twistings one after another, each mind effortlessly manipulating the energy it had trained with so often. Her onslaught was unrelenting, like a river ever churning. She pushed and pushed. And where other light twisters become frustrated by the constant need to discard wilds, she used them as unpredictable distractions. Constant cracking, erratic flashes, and the stench of sulphurous smoke turned the pit into the den of an angry dragon. But where Aquilon was the dragon and the river, Nalika was the mountain and the hare. With agility that would make a gazelle blush, she effortlessly dodged the snapping teeth of each directed attack and deflected aerial attacks like a boulder parting water. Deep within her defenses, Nalika crafted her own assault, patiently waiting for the opening she knew would eventually come when Akilan tired. But Akilan knew Nalika as well, and knew that Nalika was just hiding in her protections, waiting for an opening in Akilan's offensive. She took it for granted, as each attack she leveled was defeated. Forge fire cooled, air blades parried, Arctic avalanches absorbed, dream mists blown aside, lightning spears grounded, sunlights reflected. She would not let Nalika have that opening. At least, not until she wanted her to. Both sisters had watched every duel the other had been in, and both were acutely aware of their own and their sister's strengths and weaknesses. Nalika's greatest weakness, which she shared with all generalists, was that she couldn't twist light as quickly or as powerfully as specialists could. Akilan's, which she shared with all specialists, was that she couldn't easily shift out of the patterns that her minds had been specialized within. But, in addition to the standard weaknesses shared by all generalists and all specialists, each sister knew the other's personal approaches and weaknesses. Akilan knew that Nalika would hide in her protections, launching minor attacks designed to confuse more than damage, until an opportunity presented itself to send a single winning strike. Nalika similarly knew that Akilan would be relentless in her offensive, pounding again and again until she found, or made, a weakness in her opponent's defenses. So, each sister, in her own way, took a conservative approach, trying to lure the other into making a mistake. 3 times Akilan left an apparent opening in her attacks to bait Nalika into responding, ready to defend herself against any attack Nalika threw. But each time Nalika did nothing. She just stayed in her defenses, letting the opportunities pass. All Akilan needed was for Nalika to drop her defenses for a second, and she was sure she could win. Nalika, for her part, knew that Akilan was looking for an opening in her defenses, and that she was bound to have an out-of-sequence attack ready to slip into the gaps in her normal sequences. So, she waited, confident that if she could see the out-of-sequence attack Akilan had developed, she'd be able to counter it. After the 3rd gap in Akilan's sequence, and still no surprise attack, Nalika started to worry that Akilan might just be planning on battering her defenses down completely, and Nalika wasn't sure how much more of Akilan's assault she could withstand. Nalika bolstered her defenses, weariness slowing her oldest minds as Akilan began an attack wide and powerful designed to overwhelm static defenses with thousands of tiny strikes coming in a giant wave. A roar, like the worst hailstorm ever, rattled Nalika's body. It was as if the world's largest swarm of flies were converted to metal and used as tiny battering rams against Nalika's walls. Tsunamic rain, as it is called, is a twisting sufficiently complex that it left a slight gap in Akilan's attack sequence. Nalika was tempted to counter then, but she knew her sister was crafty, so instead she reconstituted her defenses as the rain petered out. She was lucky she had done so, because instead of allowing the gap like normally happened, Akilan had dropped her own defenses and used those mines to throw Hust's hammer immediately behind Tsunamic Rain. The hammer was Akilan's out-of-sequence attack, and it was a monster of an attack. Nalika knew that Akilan had been working on it, but she had no idea she had mastered it and refined it so that she could drop it with so few mines. Hust's hammer is a wicked combination of a standard hammer and Hust's retribution. It's an overhead attack designed to collapse force shields by simultaneously creating an unsustainable draw on the light twister, while also making everything in a region heavier by tenfold. Once fully formed, it's difficult to stop, and the best defense is to move out of its path. One of Akilan's minds momentarily panicked and tried to convince the rest that the saviors wouldn't be able to protect them from the hammer if it hit. Her other minds were stable and just ignored it. Instead, all minds that were available pitched in to redirect her force into her body for a blindingly fast speed run. In a tenth of a second, she was several yards from the path of the hammer. The wealthy spectators closest to the pit screamed as the hammer hurtled towards them, but the saviors were on the job and extinguished it before it could reach the stands. Aquilon continued her assault, but there was less confidence in her sequences, and small shifts threw off her timing, telltale signs that she was getting flustered. Nalika grinned, even as she grew more and more weary. Another big gap in Aquilon's normal sequence arrived, and again, instead of allowing the gap, she dropped her shields and formed another hammer. But Nalika was ready for it, extended her defenses, and interrupted the hammer right before Aquilon released it. The rebound and accompanying release of unfinished light twisting jolted Aquilon. Both sisters knew that Aquilon, even as fast as she was, wouldn't be able to get her shields back up before Nalika could throw her own attack. Nalika smiled as she parted her wards to throw her simple counterattack into the gap. A winning strike. But then, the klaxon blew, and Nalika's dueling shell lit up, indicating that she had lost. The crowd erupted, the specialists in delight, the generalists in consternation. Nalika scowled as a pit formed in her stomach, and she threw the attack she had primed to the ground. Her many minds reviewed every moment of the duel, looking for some mistake she had made, something she had missed. But there was nothing. She had blocked, deflected, or dodged every attack, had been perfectly patient. She hadn't opened her wards until the hammer remnants were fully dissipated. She looked up to see if Aquilon was confused as well. Perhaps it had been a mistake. But Aquilon's laughter was pure joy, untainted by confusion or from the bitterness of cheating. She jumped and hooted out her excitement, thrusting her red armband into the air. She had won, and fairly. Nalika quested out with her minds, looking for where her shell had been touched. And there, at the base of her dueling shell, so close she could have stomped on it, was the smallest radiant mechanism she had ever seen. In shape, it resembled a four-legged stick bug, except that the body and legs were no thicker than a strand of hair, and, in place of a head, it carried a pouch the size of a grain of sand. Within that pouch was a swirling mixture of energies sufficiently deadly to activate the shell. Nalika shook her head as the last of the energy in the mechanism released and the tiny creature vanished. Aquilon had created the thready legs to continuously walk, the body to turn towards Nalika, probably setting it to home in on one of her sources, and the head to deliver the killing blow. Made entirely of energy, and fed from a reservoir that moved along with it, the gossamer creation had walked right up to her defenses and probably kept trying to walk right through them for the entire duel. It wasn't until she pulled the mines off shielding and into attacking that the little guy touched her shell. Such fine detail could only have been created by specialized minds. A generalist, especially one as evenly distributed as Nalika, could never have done such delicate work. She caught her sister's eyes, and Nalika's smile mirrored Aquilon's. She had lost, but she was proud of her sister for how cunning she had been. The crowd quieted as the two ran towards each other, uncertain if true violence was to follow, which, unfortunately, is not uncommon in duels. But when the two sisters embraced, the spectators erupted again. Nalika folded out an enlarged version of the mechanism, and Aquilon amplified her voice to explain what had happened. Several in the audience laughed and clapped at the trick, but just as many booed and jeered. A group of generalists, particularly embarrassed by the loss, approached the head judge and demanded the match be stricken from the record because it wasn't a legitimate win. The energy in the mechanism, they contended, would not have defeated a true enemy, and since the sport was just a proxy for life-or-death duels, because the mechanism couldn't have even injured Nalika, it should not have counted for a win. The head judge, however, overruled them. Nalika accepted the trophy and prize sources, and the twins left for the long journey home. The evening of the third day of walking required them to cross the source trail at a wide expanse of grassland, with a single path going north to south. To any ordinary traveler, it would have appeared as safe a place to travel as could be. The greatest threat was the biting fly, and being lulled to sleep by the calming scents of wildflowers. But to a light twister, especially one who had previously suffered on the source trail, it was a place to be wary of. The sisters were aware, but not sufficiently wary, and they loved to tempt fate. In doing so, though, they failed to consider that because Akilon's new sources were significantly more powerful, they were also significantly brighter to other light twisters than her old sources. From the north, they saw sources racing towards them. At first, a nervous excitement gripped the two. Was this an approaching challenge, or just someone in a hurry? However, as the sources drew closer and began to resolve, their nervous excitement shifted to worry. The approaching group carried enough sources to seriously threaten the sisters if they were hostile, but not enough to be a Karental cadre, who would most likely be friendly. The group's sources were inferior to what the twins had. Logic dictated that they offer the trade, drop their sources and run, in hopes that the oncoming light twisters would not pursue them once they had the twins' sources. But neither sister was willing to abandon her sources. Both sisters threw up detection fields far ahead of themselves, folded out quantities of force, and carefully releasing them within their bodies, began to run across the open field, away from the approaching party. Their surroundings became a blur as each step took them several paces, and they moved faster than a falcon could dive. They bent all their many minds towards ensuring each foot was placed just right, that the vectors were properly aligned, and that no obstruction was in their path. A trip or collision at that speed would leave them pulpy smears across the ground. Their feet slapped lightly on the ground, barely audible above the wind rushing past their ears. Any hope that the party was not following them was removed as their pursuers veered off the path and headed straight towards them. If you have already gained the ability to sense sources, then you know that it is not a directional experience, that you can sense sources behind you and to your sides without turning to look at them. This is incredibly useful when searching for sources, but also when being chased by other light twisters. In this case, though, it only served to increase the twins' dread. As the party drew nearer, the twins could see 6 high-power, high-purity heat sources with significant force in them. That suggested there were at least 6 light twisters in the group who were powerful and skilled enough to survive the northern desert. As they pressed forward, the fields across which they dashed began to grow uneven, and they were forced to slow. Ahead, a dense forest of pines, undulating in the breeze, was both a refuge and a death trap. Within the cover of the trees, their pursuers would have to slow, but so would the twins. There was no hiding from light twisters when you, too, were carrying sources. And still, neither sister was willing to give up her sources to save her life. Not needing to talk, they both raced full tilt to the forest's edge, and then, with an immense quantity of force, vectors fully reversed, stopped beside the first trees. The sisters made their preparations for battle, threw up shields around themselves, and carefully moved away from each other and several feet back into the woods. Forests are tricky places for light twisters. Not only can we not easily move fast, but we also have to be careful on the drain on our shields as they use up energy pushing undergrowth out of the way and trying to do the same to sturdy trees. In dense forests, it's best to just not use a shield unless you've mastered the ability to keep it conformed to the shape of your body. A rare skill usually only found in those with an affinity for force. The first of their pursuers, several seconds ahead of his companions, seemed to come apart, and like a child's tower of wooden blocks kicked to the floor, he skidded across the ground in so many pieces. The sisters shared a disappointed grin. Nalika's airblade had caught him at the thighs, and Akilon's through his chest and arms. He was foolish to have been caught by such a simple trap. Any light twister worth his sources knows to be careful speedrunning around an enemy, and that it's foolish to do so without some sort of detection in front of you. But they had each hoped more of their pursuers would meet the same demise. They were also disappointed because this one enemy, parts strewn at the forest's opening, was not one who had a high-powered heat source. 8 light twisters instantly stopped on seeing their companion dismembered and wrapped themselves in defense. The rush of air they dragged along with them washed over the sisters, pushing away the smell of tree sap and carrying along with it the stench of sweat on travel-dirty bodies. The light twisters wore the rough, stained leathers of the Madenka, a faction within Falstrachek, the other well-known light twisting order. The Madenka teach that light twisters are not only above non-light twisters, but that we are an altogether different kind of being. It's a ridiculous philosophy, rejected by the vast majority of light twisters, and is counter to all reason. Akilon's already pounding heart began to hammer when she realized who they had been chased by. A rush of excitement gripped her body as fear coursed through her, but she only allowed one mind to panic. The rest she marshaled and began directing attacks. The remaining Madenka were not caught off guard, nor did they wait to talk. Hundreds of quantities of energy, like fist-sized balls of partially transparent, colorful gases swirling within shells of crystal, folded into sources, zipped through the air, twisting and combining. If she had only one mind to observe it all, the scene would have overwhelmed her. As it was, the view simply confirmed for her that these Madenka were assembling an arsenal. A little behind the rest stood a man with a braided beard, whom Akilon presumed was the leader. His heavy jowls and longer forehead marked him older than the rest, and he was the only one who held close to as many quantities of energy as Akilon and Nalika. His cruel smile showed yellow teeth, and Akilon could almost smell his foul breath. He was doing something intricate with his energies, creating paper-thin structures, stacked and twisted. Akilon would have liked to watch him, but she couldn't even spare a single mind. Taking in the rest of the Madenka, she realized that the group commanded at least 3 times as much power as the twins did. Akilon's dueling sequences kicked in, and she began to move. Dashing perpendicular to the forest's edge, she twisted a rod of light around a rod of heat, then released them both within a larger cylinder of heat. The light and heat rods melted into one, shifting to a darker, more volatile energy that rolled like a snake in pain. The minds that were holding the twisted rods immediately reinforced the column of heat, which vibrated at the dark energy writhing within it. Akilon took aim at a slight man with too many tassels on his chest and a mouth too big for his face, who stood adjacent to the leader, and released the heat. It shifted into a column of sunlight, which shot forward, burning through a bush before bursting out of the woods. Simultaneously, other minds had crafted and sent the slower-moving forge fire at the same target. She could just make out the contempt on his face as he deflected the sunlight, a very basic attack that's easily countered when you see it coming, back towards her. But it didn't go far. Instead, the column of sunlight bounced at an angle off the reflective light twisting she had embedded within the forge fire. The forge fire, for its part, simply collided with the target's protective wall of air, dumping all of its heat. The wall began to glow an incandescent red, igniting the grass above which it hung, but causing no real damage. The Madenka sneered as he cooled the wall and sent something like shattering darts her way. A split-second burst of force moved her out of their path, and just for good measure she charged the foliage behind her with bio, creating a dense thicket of growth between her and the darts. Through a gap between the trees to her right, She saw the leader's beady eyes widen as the reflected column of sunlight struck him from the unexpected direction of his companion. It burned a hole the size of an Arentish crown through his shoulder. The most common defenses, force shields and walls of air, will stop or slow most fast-moving attacks. One exception is sunlight, which passes through both force and air as if they weren't there. As I said earlier, it's not very useful normally because it's so easy to deflect. But if you aren't watching for it, and who does from a friend, it can be devastating. Like an arrow being loosed before being fully drawn, several of the leader's attacks were released before he finished them. They fizzed and sputtered out, tossing brightly colored sparks and dripping goo-like light. Several spots of earth were charred where stray energy landed. One clump of energy plowed into her original target, blowing him off his feet with a huge gust of wind. He slammed into a tree trunk with a meaty thud that made the branches shake, then flopped to the ground. The only thing that would have made the touch sweeter was if she could have heard the screams over the shredding pine needles and splintering wood of the darts tearing up the trees behind her. With their strongest fighter wounded, she put the finishing touches on and lobbed a percussive immolation, hoping to finish him off either with that or the lightning spears she was about to release. But before she could, the earth jerked violently and then gave way, crumbling beneath her. She screamed as she plunged downward, the remnants of her incomplete lightning sending jolts through her muscles and plunging into the soil past which she was falling. Pain lanced up her leg as she released a blend of heat and cold to create a platform of air beneath her feet. Several yards below, she sensed a radiant mechanism expel the last of the energy it was carrying, and more earth cascaded down onto her and her platform as the hole into which she had fallen widened. She cursed, impressed by the idea of a digging mechanism. The ground had blocked enough of the energy in the mechanism's payload that she hadn't registered it as a threat. It was also like what she had done to Nalika during the duel, but actually deadly. The sound of her percussive immolation reached her, but her heart sank when it was not accompanied by any screams. Several of Akilan's minds were shouting at those that were impressed by the maneuver and those that were disappointed about the percussive immolation. Even underground, the free minds saw that the remaining attacks were all focused on Nalika, and her defenses were failing. Akilan loaded her body with force and launched herself upward. Her ankle throbbed, but her anxiety over her sister left no minds free to focus on it. She flew out of the hole, burning through pine needles and branches, to punch through the top of the forest, surrounded by smoke and flame. Her anxiety for her sister had motivated her minds, and she had half a dozen attacks on the way before her actual sight caught up with her radiant sight. Akilan blinked several times. This is pointless, since radiant sight has nothing to do with our eyes, but we all still do it. Nalika's failing defenses had been a feint, and with excellently timed strikes she had penetrated the defenses of several of the Maudanka. The four still standing Maudanka streaked away from the forest's edge back towards the path in full speed run. One tripped, the loud snaps and cracks of his bones shattering as he tumbled across the grass seemed to punctuate the other's retreat. Their sources shrank, then grew indistinct, then finally disappeared. The only energy still in play was what she and Nalika held. Akilan lowered herself back to the ground, gingerly resting her aching ankle. The remaining Maudanka, like so many rag dolls tossed by an angry child, lay on the plain before the forest, bodies torn and twisted, some still smoldering, others covered in a growing layer of frost. A sickening smell of burnt pork and grass filled the air, but a smile pulled at Akilan's lips. Her sister had done this. Akilan jumped in the air and hooted, then grimaced when her ankle gave out beneath her. The walk home was slow, but blessedly peaceful. When the two returned to the conference the following season, they did not enroll to compete. Instead, with the modest wealth from the Maudanka's sources, they set up a second tournament where stronger light twisters faced off with groups of weaker light twisters. It quickly became apparent that while specialists of equal or greater strength tend to beat generalists one-on-one, generalists perform much better against groups of weaker light twisters, which is the prevailing wisdom today. Now, despite the excitement of this story, please do not learn the wrong lesson. The most important factor in any duel, or, hust forbid, an actual fight between light twisters, is power, followed very closely by skill. And the only factors that seem to influence power, that is, the rate of mind development and strength, are the age at which you begin twisting light, which you can't control, and the intensity with which your first few minds are trained, which you can. Priming, folding, and streaming. With a basic understanding of light twisters and their relationship to radiant energy, we can return to sources and energy. Sources come in different strengths, not to be confused with the quality of energy we discussed earlier. Strength refers to how much energy a source radiates over a given period of time. But how can we measure energy? Through density and volume. I'm going to assume you know what volume is, how much space something takes up, but density might be unfamiliar. For a light twister, density refers to how squeezed or loose energy is. One mystery of nature that has proven immensely useful in training and communicating among light twisters is that all light twisters experience density the same, and all can recognize when the density is right. That is, the density where energy does not feel like it's being squeezed or allowed to be loose. When energy feels just right, neither squeezed nor loose, we say it is single density. Remarkably, this sense of single density is perfectly consistent. It doesn't depend on a mind's strength, age, specialization, or even a light twister's affinity for a particular kind of energy. All light twisters holding the same quantity of energy in the same shape and size will assess it to have the same density relative to the natural density of that energy. So, with volume and density established, we can talk about specific amounts of energy. A single density quantity of energy, the size of an average man's fist, is 1 unit of energy. A source that radiates 1 unit of energy in 5 minutes is considered a middling source. One that produces the same energy in 1 minute is strong or powerful. Useful effects require significantly more than 1 unit of energy. If light twisters had to sit and collect energy from sources at their natural rates, it would take an hour to get enough heat to warm up a cup of tea, or cold to cool down a cup of water. Creating sky-filling fire flowers would take days, and more ambitious light twistings might take a lifetime just to gather enough energy. Fortunately, there are ways to draw more energy from sources than just letting them radiate naturally. There are stories about a faction of light twisters who believed it was more wholesome to collect energy as it flowed from sources. To them, using any technique to increase the extraction speed from sources was a perversion. Of course, that faction died out pretty quickly when people who didn't share their view came and took all their sources. The first and most common method for getting energy from sources faster is folding. Folding causes a source to produce more energy than it does naturally. The process is straightforward, though its underlying mechanisms have yet to be discovered. A light twister collects energy from a source and then pushes that energy back into the source. This stimulates the source to produce twice as much energy as was forced back inside it. So, folding a single unit into a source will yield 2 units. Folding in 2 units will yield 4 units, 4, 8, and so on. Folding can continue as long as the light twister is strong enough to collect the released energy and then control it. Newer, weaker minds might struggle to hold a single unit of single density energy, and usually cannot squeeze it back into a source. Stronger minds might be able to squeeze a single unit of energy down to 128 density, which would be about the size of the last segment of your pinky finger. The most common approach to folding involves enclosing a source with a mind, and then contracting the boundaries of the mind, squeezing the energy back into the source. Once the mind passes the outer layer of the source, the energy is folded, and the source emits twice the energy that was squeezed in. If the light twister isn't ready with another mind enclosing the source, all that energy will be lost. You can probably imagine this cycle of mind after mind squeezing energy into the source while the next one in line collects the resultant radiating energy. How fast a light twister can reconstitute the collecting bubble around a source and squeeze the energy back into it will determine how fast they can extract energy from a source. There's a great deal of variation in how fast light twisters can twist light, both in collecting energy and in twisting it into something useful. The individual strength of one's mind is often viewed as a personal matter that isn't discussed in polite company, though a great many light twisters seem to be afflicted with poor manners. This is especially common among young male light twisters who engage in light twister games where they see whose minds are the strongest through a variety of competitions. Dueling is the most severe form of this affliction, and it often ends badly for one of the participants. Other competitions, though, include seeing who can hold the most energy with a single mind, similar to weightlifting with the physical body, and struggling against other light twisters to take possession of a quantity of energy, which is very much like arm wrestling. There are, of course, the broader light twister sports, light ball, speed, blind fish, etc. But even the newest among you need no introduction to those. Streaming is a similar but much more challenging technique, where folding requires collecting a distinct quantity and squeezing it back into the source. Streaming requires gathering all the energy radiating from a source and actively guiding all of it back into the source. This is best visualized, and is often carried out, as a ball or shell around the source that has a funnel on one side that goes into a pipe that loops around and then plunges back into the source. So, where folding yields a two-fold, hence the name, return of energy for each fold until a maximum density is produced, streaming increases the return not with every fold, but with every instant. A more detailed explanation, complete with illustrations, will be provided later to help clarify this further. A comparison of the two techniques is warranted. Folding, first, is much easier to manage. A pair of minds can fold out more energy than is usually needed. Folding is much more efficient than streaming because the light twister can stop folding before exceeding their ability to control the quantity of energy produced. Streaming is much faster. However, it is also very leaky, very wasteful, as significant quantities of energy are lost before a light twister can stop the stream. The biggest difference, though, comes from something we haven't discussed yet. Up to this point, we have acknowledged that real sources always radiate a mixture of energies. A heat source will be mostly heat, but will also have some force and some light in it, for example. But we've been as guilty as the storytellers who pretend sources are pure light or pure bile. I've explained that when I fold energy into a source, it increases the rate that the resulting energy is released from the source. You have probably imagined this all happening with a single pure source. That is, I take a unit of heat, drop it into a heat source, and then the source emits 2 units of heat. However, there's no such thing as a pure heat source. Let's pause on talking about folding for just a moment and only consider the initial collection of energy from a radiating source. Imagine a high-purity heat source that only radiates one other type of energy. Let's say the source is 10% light. To efficiently collect energy from this source, I'd need to use 2 minds because there are 2 kinds of energy. If I only used one mind, my collection efficiency would drop because I could only collect one type of energy. The other energy would completely escape. So, if I collect heat, all the light energy would radiate away. But it's worse than that. A portion of the heat energy would also slip through my mind's control, escaping along with the light energy. If you care to know, we can actually calculate the maximum portion of energy a single mind can collect. The square of the portion of the source that emits the energy you're trying to collect. So, in this case, 90% of the 90% of the source, that is heat, is only 81% of the energy that gets radiated. Or 10% of the source's 10%, that is light, yields only 1% of the energy that gets radiated. You can see why multiple minds is crucial when collecting the smaller portions of energy from a source. So, using 2 minds, I collect a whole unit of heat and a little over 1/10 unit of light. I then have to take that time to separate these 2 energies because they are fully mixed when I extract them. We call this process of separating energies skimming, like skimming the cream off of fresh milk or pulling oil off the top of water. If we let the quantity sit long enough, the 2 energies will eventually separate on their own, like cream from milk or oil from water, but it's a very slow process. Our minds can actively pull the 2 apart from each other much faster, but we still call it skimming. So, after I skim the light off the heat, what will happen when I fold the heat back into the source? Of course, I'll get out double the energy I put in, so you might assume I'd get 2 units of heat. But that's not what will happen because the energy I folded in didn't go to a pure heat source. What I'd end up with instead is a little less than 2 units of heat and a small portion of some other energy. That small portion wouldn't be heat or light, but would be a wild energy. Energies that come from folding one kind of energy into a source of a different kind, like folding heat energy into a light source, are unstable, angry energies that cause unpredictable effects, but usually make a loud sound or crazy lights when released in air. In general, they can't be used for anything useful, hence the name wild. The safest practice is to skim the wild energy off, spread it out so it's very diffuse, and thus has very little effect, and then release it. But think through the ramifications of what I've just explained. Imagine you have a source that radiates 3 qualities of heat, 2 qualities of bio, and 1 quality of force. Recall that the different qualities mean that the energy coming from the source can be separated into different intensities of a given energy. Now, imagine that you want force. Several of your minds and a significant amount of your time will be devoted to skimming off the wild energies as you gather the force. What if you were in a rush and forgot to skim off all the unwanted energy during the folding process? The image on the next page may help you to visualize this situation. Well, you'd start with 3 types of energy, heat, bio, and force, that you cram into 6 types of sources, 3 different heat sources, 2 different bio sources, 1 force source. You'd then end up with 18 types of energy, only one of which, force, you actually care about. 2 others, 3 parts heat and 2 parts bio, have useful known effects. But 12 are wild energies. You'll need at least 15 minds to efficiently collect this, and that's just from the first fold. If you fold all of that again, you'd end up with 54 different energies, most of which will be wilds. To make matters worse, you'd still only have a small amount of force, which was your initial goal. You can see why it's crucial to skim off the extras at each fold. A fortunate feature of nature is that energy preferentially folds into its own source. About 2/3 of the energy goes directly to its own source, and the remaining 1/3 spreads out evenly across the whole source. This means that even if my source only has a tiny portion of force, when I fold in force energy, I'll still get about 1.5 times more force out than I put in. I'll get many wilds, but my force will increase with each fold. Now, if we consider streaming, you could imagine how messy things can become as energy flows right back into the source. Yes, expert light twisters can skim while streaming, pulling the wilds off, but it requires a great deal of strength and dozens or more minds to do it successfully. Usually, regardless of the effort, some wilds slip past the scoop that does the skimming and produce unpredictable effects. This is the primary reason why most light twisters avoid streaming. However, there is one additional reason, which brings us back around to the topic of sources in the next chapter. But before we do that, a final word needs to be shared about the power of a source. The observant reader might point out that the strength of a source only really matters during the initial collection of energy. After that, the speed with which a light twister can fold or stream the energy back into the source is all that really matters. This line of thought might lead one to conclude that source strength or power doesn't matter, except when the light twister is in a hurry. However, what I haven't yet mentioned is that power correlates directly to the total energy available within a source. That is, a more powerful source will last longer than a weaker source. So, while it's true that the rate at which a source gives off energy only really matters for the first moment in the energy collection process, because the light twister will start folding or streaming, drastically surpassing the natural radiating rate for the source, a powerful source is still more valuable because it will produce more energy before becoming extinguished, or, as we'll discuss next, shifting to emitting a different kind of energy. Shifting sources. As sources release their energy, they change. The simplest of sources grow weaker until they cease to radiate energy and are just normal rocks. In some ways, a pure source like this would be among the most valuable. You can stream it until you've extracted all the energy it has without worrying about wilds, and then discard it. Such sources, though, are very rare. Instead, what happens with most sources is that as they radiate away their energy, they shift into a new kind of source. Again, let's imagine a pure light source. Over time, as you use it, it will radiate less light and begin to radiate something else, for example, cold. As you continue to use the source, the light will keep shifting to cold. Then, as the cold gets used, it may begin to change into bio, for example. So, eventually, the source that started out as pure light might radiate several different kinds of energies before the final type of energy in the chain of shifting transitions to nothing, rendering the source exhausted. Sources from particular locations often follow a specific chain of shifting. For example, most sources from Dembahedro are light sources, but they shift from light to cold, and then from cold to a strong light, then to heat, and then back to a weak light before expiring. So, a well-used source from Dembahedro will contain 3 kinds of light, 1 cold, and 1 heat within it. Sources with a known lineage are more valuable than those of unknown origins. Another valuable type of source is the so-called self-sharpening source. These sources shift from one form of energy to another form of the same energy, effectively doubling that energy's lifespan within the source. In nature, shifting can be mind-bogglingly slow, but an active light twister can see changes in their sources over the course of a few months. A streaming light twister can watch the changes happen before their very eyes, and if they're not careful, they'll become overwhelmed while trying to skim off wilds. This can lead to serious consequences, like damaged minds, or, in very unlucky cases, death. Herosidon and Laharamark. Herosidon and Laharamark were proponents of 2 different approaches to streaming, and were very vocal in their claims that their method was superior. The debate grew, and the obvious solution was to have a demonstration. However, The difference in output of the two methods became most apparent at extremely high rates of streaming. Because sources are so valuable, neither side was willing to sacrifice their collection for the demonstration, and so the bitterness and acrimony between the two camps persisted, even though no one knew for sure which technique was better. Fortunately, the perfect opportunity arose, and Herosadon and Laharamark agreed to a competition. To understand this contest, though, a little context is required. From the flat, fertile fields of Toyokusa, a solitary hill bulges upward like a massive earthen tree stump. The hill's edges curve up to an almost vertical rocky surface, but the top is as flat as if a giant had sawn off the peak. Were it not for the ramp that snakes upward around the perimeter, no one would be able to reach the top, which stands near 40 men tall and is over 2,000 paces across. Although many speculate a light twister with powerful sources was involved, no one knows for sure how or when the first man reached the summit. Even more mysterious, though, is where the two white-hot slabs at the heart of the plateau came from. Each the size of a large puddle, they emitted so much heat that exposed skin would begin to burn within 30 paces. Falling leaves from the surrounding forests would smolder as they drifted overhead and burst into flames if blown too close. Encircling each slab, the warm ground felt as hard as kiln-fired pottery, coated in the soot and ash of decades of fallen foliage and the charred remains of ill-fated trees. Despite the inhospitable site, once the people of Toyokusa learned about the slabs, they quickly carved the spiraling ramp and with great care, using the local clay and timber, crafted multi-port forges around them. With a seemingly endless supply of incredibly intense heat, they could produce more worked metals than any other forging community in Thadrin. Soon, the world's finest smiths moved to Toyokusa, enchanted by the constant, uniform temperature forge that required no fuel, produced no smoke, had no need of maintenance throughout the day, and could accommodate dozens of smiths and their apprentices simultaneously. Within a generation, Toyokusa had become synonymous with master smiths and world-class metalwork. But, as the apprentices to the first generation of smiths took over from their masters, something terrifying happened. Toyokusa's never-cooling forges began to cool. A whole generation of smiths, accustomed to wealth and notoriety, but who knew nothing about maintaining a forge, were confronted with a future of hunger and impoverished death. As swords were drawn and hammers hefted, the debate of how to proceed almost came to bloodshed. Fortunately, Adalbert, the same known from many stories, including the king's swords, saw the ruin that infighting would bring upon them, and instead suggested hiring a light twister to investigate the hill. As is sometimes the case in our day, light twisters in that day caused reflexive panic, and where moments earlier the smiths had been ready to kill one another, their common fear united the group against Adalbert. Fortunately for everyone there, Adalbert was as skilled with his words as he was with his hammer. Dressed in nothing finer than the sleeveless shirt and leather apron that smiths of all ages have worn, he calmed the mob, persuading them he could bring salvation to Toyokusa. You have doubtless heard stories of Adalbert's search for and successful tricking of a light twister. Please know that those stories are told by non-light twisters to comfort themselves into thinking that they could gain an advantage over a light twister. There is nothing about being a light twister that binds you to your words beyond your own moral convictions. While true histories do not explain how Adalbert enlisted a light twister, that he succeeded is without doubt. Arnold Scravey, the same known for many of the light twistings we use today, returned with Adalbert to Toyokusa. Wearing the horrendous robes of skins and peaked shoulders and bones for clasps that light twisters in his day so often wore, he caused several of the apprentices to drop their hammers and flee as he approached the forges. The stories say that Scravey wore the furry blue skin of the ice dragon he had slain to obtain his cold sores from, and that the skin could never be fully cured like a seal's or a walrus's can, and so constantly smelled of wet dog and fish. Using a light twisting he had been developing for finding buried treasure, Scravy folded out several dozens of units of light. He took that quantity and flattened it to a fingernail's thickness and compressed it to triple density. This yielded a glowing golden sheet the size of a small boat's sail, but, of course, only he could see it. Into this he combined, then uniformly spread and released, a small amount of heat and bio. Those two swelled up, glittering like pearlescent loaves of bread, and then deflated, shattering once they touched the surface of the sheet, into pebble-sized shards that seemed to perforate the sheet of light, resembling 3-day stubble on a man's cheek. The effort required to ensure a uniformity in these shards took the majority of Scravy's minds. With those that had been idle, in quick succession, he folded out several more units of energy, then layered and released them within one another until he had what looked to the radiant sight like a sphere of water with a thin sheen of oil swirling on its surface. This he flattened until it covered the sheet of light, then pressed it onto the side with the shards. At the time, this was a very novel design, but it is fairly common now, and much easier due to subsequent improvements since Scravy first created it, and is known as a sweep. Lowering the sweep into the ground, beneath the forges, he could sense the changes in the composition of the earth. In his treasure-seeking, he was feeling for places where stone or soil shifted to dense metals. But, to his surprise, what Scravy found beneath the forges was almost no change at all. The white-hot slab of whatever the material was continued for several paces below where it protruded, almost like a giant tooth just breaking the surface of a baby's gums. He nearly lost the structure when the composition abruptly changed. Into what, he could not tell, but the feedback from the sweep, akin to tactile sense for your radiant sight, shifted from a hot solid to a scorching, vibrating, almost roaring quality. He sat there, exploring the sensation while moving the sweep this way and that. To the smiths, though, the sight was disconcerting. The gray-haired, blue-clad light twister had been staring at a junior apprentice since arriving, not saying a word. The rotten fish smell of his robes slowly grew in the forge's heat until it was unbearable. The poor apprentice, too scared to move, just stood there, shaking slightly as the rest of the smiths backed away. Then the light twister's eyes widened, and he let out a quiet grunt. The apprentice jerked in surprise, and then dashed back to his master. The senior smiths, frustration growing, rounded on Adalbert and demanded to know if he had brought them an addled light twister in the harshest of whispers. Addled or not, no one wanted to disturb the old man. But, as Adalbert opened his mouth to reply, Scravy cackled. He turned to the clump of smiths and explained that the heat in the slabs was supplied by a natural circulation of immensely hot liquid rock. Further, he deduced that the circulation had slowed and the temperature of the liquid rock had dropped. It would continue to drop until the liquid rock stopped circulating and solidified, after which the slabs would become as cold as the surrounding hill. Bitterly disappointed, the smiths again turned their minds to violence against one another. In Adalbert's absence, a cabal had formed, and agreed that the best path forward was reducing the number of smiths pulling heat from the forge, so they could preserve the heat for themselves. They approached Adalbert with their idea, knowing he was the best smith of Toyokusa and not wishing to lose his clientele. They invited him to join them in their planned midnight massacre. But Scravy, hearing their murderous wishes, offered a better solution. For a life-sized statue of himself crafted in pure gold, with emeralds for eyes and silk for hair, he promised he would replenish the heat in the hill. Mollified, the cabal set aside their plans and agreed to convince the remaining smiths to accept his offer. Scravy began the task by extracting heat from dozens of sources and dumping it into the hill. Hour after hour, day after day, he extracted and poured until the slabs glowed more brightly than anyone could remember. Exhausted, and greatly indebted to other light twisters for their sources that he had drained, Scravy asked for his statue. Instead, 7 greedy smiths, half of the original cabal, pulled their swords and demanded that he leave without pay. As tired as he was, the weeks of toil had so sharpened Scravy's minds to working with heat that he instantly melted the swords, coating every hand that held one in molten steel. The remaining smiths, and the apprentices of those who turned against Scravy, delivered his statue to him and promised to display the glove-like hunks of sword steel forever, as a reminder that greed destroyed the livelihood of the 7 smiths who attempted to rob a light twister. We will leave stories of Adalbert and his run-ins with the Cabal for other books. It was into this historical context that Herosidon and Laharamark stepped many generations later. The heat in the twin forges required replenishment once every generation or so, and the smiths were always very generous in their payment for the service. By this time, Carental had taken over the job of providing for the replenishment, often tasking dozens of apprentices with the work. So, when the time came, it presented the perfect opportunity for the 2 camps to demonstrate their superiority. With a guarantee from Carental that they'd be able to replace their sources after rendering the service, Herosidon and Laharamark agreed to the competition. Each would use their technique to replenish one of the forges. The one who reached the target temperature and circulation first, as measured by several independent light twister observers, would be acknowledged as having developed the superior streaming technique. Surrounded by the smiths, the observers, and representatives from Carental, they took their positions in front of the forges. Laharamark's technique is the one most widely used today. Essentially, you use several mines to form a shell around the source to capture the energy that is radiated out. Another set of mines creates a tube through which the energy leaves the shell and then loops back through the shell and directly into the source. As the rate of radiance increases, you bolster the shell with your mines. The resulting structure resembles a ball with a thick loop that looks like a handle. It also has 2 openings, one for the desired energy and one for the wilds. This basic structure had been in use long before Laharamark's improvement. Under former circumstances, energy streamed like this would be funneled by several mines into a large quantity, and other mines would then work to separate the desired and useful energy from the wilds. Once the quantity of energy that Light Twister could manage was reached, the mines would release the wilds as described above, spreading them out so diffuse, and, if possible, so far away, that they had no discernible impact. Laharamark devised an ingenious structure, which she termed the scoop, placed in front of the tube that allowed energy to exit the shell. The scoop filters out both wilds and undesired energies, funneling them off to a distant structure for later disposal. The desired energy is then streamed back into the source. A basic drawing of this structure can be seen above. Let me pause here and remind you readers that these words shell, tube, and structure all refer to shapes that Light Twister's minds force the radiant energy into. They are not physical objects at all, and are in fact invisible to other Light Twisters, discernible only by the effects they have on radiant energy. Much like how glass in flowing water is invisible, except for the particulate pulled along by the water as it streams around the glass. While demonstrated on rare occasions, Laharamark was unwilling to sacrifice vast quantities of energy to prove that her structure could withstand the greater forces involved in what might be termed source-draining streaming. So, uncertainty remained. Herosidon's technique was not nearly so novel as it was audacious. Instead of using one large scoop to filter out all the wilds and funnel them away, he constructed several simple scoops along the length of the streaming tube. Each mini-scoop filtered out small portions of the unwanted energies, thus reducing the total number of mines required to maintain the scoop. This became particularly valuable at very high flow rates of energy. A basic drawing of his structure can be seen above. That design wasn't the most audacious part of his approach, though. Rather, Instead of collecting the wilds, he simply funneled them so far away, widening the funneling tube so much that the wilds would be sufficiently diffuse as they were released that they would have no effect at all. In fact, he claimed the improved design had so much efficiency that he could manage streaming back and forth between 3 sources. No one had attempted such a feat before, and for good reason, as everyone in attendance learned. At the agreed-upon signal, the light twisters began their streaming. For the other light twisters in attendance, time seemed to slow down as each mind monitored a separate part of the process. Both competitors' techniques worked as described. Laharamark, wearing a utilitarian woolen robe, white with brown trim along the pockets, hem, and wide sleeves, placed her heat source on the heel of an anvil, set up the form, and started streaming. She clasped her delicate hands in front of her, and funneled heat energy into the earth beneath her slab, initially at standard streaming power, then rapidly increasing to 10 times what had ever been achieved before. She accumulated wilds so rapidly that she released them in great belching, percussive strikes akin to someone pounding on a drum. Each thump seemed to drive a new drop of sweat from her temples. Herosidon, with grim determination pressing deep lines into his pale face, hunched over an anvil, gripping it like he would collapse without it. Where Laharamark's streaming was measured in each beat of her wild's drum, Herosidon's was measured by the volume of his wild's roar, at least at first. All who were present agreed that he underestimated the effect of streaming between 3 sources. Within seconds, his power surged over 100 times what had been previously achieved, and continued to rise quickly. At such a high extraction rate, his sources shifted violently. One witness said, "So rapid were the sources consumed that it was like watching a bolt of lightning change colors as it streaked down from the sky." Even the non-light twister smiths spoke of how his sources began to shimmer and sparkle like the northern night sky, and the anvil began to sag like it was melting. The quantity and variety of energies coming from his sources soon overwhelmed several of Herosidon's filtering scoops, quite probably killing those minds that sought to maintain them. The mixture of energies that then flowed through the sources led to an incalculable increase in wild energy production, causing the entire structure to collapse while releasing all the energy it had contained. Fortunately, even as Herosidon's technique came apart, Laharamark kept her wits, carefully ended her streaming, and threw up protections around herself and those near her, or the tragedy might have been worse. As Herosidon's energies combined in some unwholesome amalgam, a huge blast rocked the hilltop, throwing everyone to the ground. But so much worse than that. After the flatulating, slimy sparks and tossed grit of thousands of wilds extinguishing themselves ceased, a variety of phenomena reigned behind. The most startling of which was a surface that, for several seconds, appeared to reflect all unreleased energy impinging on it. The second most startling was a dark mist that floated in a straight line towards the, by then, unconscious Herosidon. It neither dissipated as it moved along, nor seemed hampered by the numerous anvils through which it sailed as though they weren't there. When it reached Herosidon, who had collapsed across the anvil, it reacted so violently with his flesh that a second mist, this one of red, plumed upward, then drifted down on the hilltop, coating it with a slick sheen. A tangy, feculent miasma wafted over the assembled people, causing many to cough and retch. All that remained where Herosidon had lain was a dripping pile of rags. The mist sailed right through the hill itself, emerging only slightly smaller on the other side, and it was later reported, continued to lay waste to a wide swath of grain and liquefied several pigs penned adjacent to the field before disappearing below the ground. A great deal of study went into trying to discover precisely which mixture of wilds produced the reflection that was briefly observed, but no one found it. The construction of the mist, however, was easily discovered, as there are several different types of wilds that can be combined to cause it. It seems to be an unholy mutation of bio and force that causes living matter on the tiniest scale to swell to the point of bursting, while also causing every piece of the living matter to repel every other piece of living matter, leading to a pulverizative explosion of anything alive while harmlessly passing right through inorganic material. This is a fantastic approach to dealing with vermin infestations, although a thorough washing is necessary following its application. After the dust, and Horosidon, settled on the hilltop, several cheeky minds pointed out that before turning himself into a spray of red paint, Horosidon had completed the task in less than a minute with his technique. Lahermark required several more hours of her technique and several more sources to complete hers. So, not only was Horosidon's technique faster, but it also seemed somehow able to extract significantly more heat energy from the sources than any other known technique. However, despite the effectiveness of his technique, no one ever employs it for obvious reasons. As scholars have considered potential ways to make this technique safer, most agree that the rapid shift in sources is the greatest threat to its stability. As previously mentioned, sources under normal usage shift slowly, and in nature they typically shift at a glacial pace. The exception to the slow shift in nature is found in the dragons of Thadrin. For example, some sources of heat shift to force, especially those from the northern desert. This shift from heat to force is the most probable cause of death among the long-living fire dragons, who have no natural predators, except, of course, source-hunting light twisters. As these dragons age, they become larger and larger. The two sources that enable them to breathe fire also become larger and larger. With larger sources, the more energy they produce, and the more rapid the shift from heat to force. This continues until fire blowing also includes a great wave of force energy in wilds, which blows one source out of the back of the dragon's head and also spreads its teeth and jaw a great distance. Hence the expression, "When the teeth are spread, keep your eyes peeled." While most people have come to use this expression as an indication to watch for danger, linking it to a wild beast opening a toothy maw, it was originally a reminder to those hunting high-quality sources that shards of dragon skull and scattered teeth usually indicated the proximity of two powerful heat sources, though invariably with a significant portion of force in them. A final note on streaming. It is an unfortunate consequence of organic language development that light twisters also use the word streaming for another practice. We will briefly step into the next topic before actually getting there. A typical light twisting involves taking a quantity of energy, shaping and mixing it, and then releasing it. How long the effect produced lasts depends on the amount of energy, but usually it's long enough for the purpose at hand. However, sometimes a longer effect is needed, like when you are holding a force field around your body to protect yourself from physical attack. There are several ways to produce longer effects, but the easiest is simply to add more energy to the structure already established. This process, unfortunately, is also sometimes referred to as streaming. Because energy travels so quickly, once a shape is established for a particular effect, any additional energy added to the shape will quickly fill the entire structure. This means that a light twister doesn't have to do any additional work shaping the energy he streams from his source to the light twisting structure. I have endeavored to shift the vernacular to the use of funneling for this practice, and while it has gained some use, it has yet to become the dominant term. I invite each of you, who have not yet been ingrained with this confusing vocabulary, to resolutely use funneling anytime you wish to describe this phenomenon of moving energy directly into an exigent light twisting structure without shaping the energy first, and to use streaming to refer to the energy extraction technique exclusively. We have established all the fundamentals of sources and energy, and can now touch briefly on twisting light. Twisting light. The key skill that all light twisters must develop is the ability to precisely control energy. When described like that, it sounds easy enough, but in practice, it's like trying to fill a giant bag with water using only your hands, and then using sticks and string to force the bag into a specific shape. Of course, you're doing all this with your minds, not your hands, but the feeling is much the same. The energy wants to spread out, just as water does. Your minds hold it, like the bag, and then shape it like the sticks and string. Of course, once you've tried it yourself a few times, you'll understand exactly what I'm describing. That might take some time though, because filling that bag with water is very difficult for young minds. Many light twisting effects depend on the shape of the energy when released. Specifically, energy prefers to escape shapes through narrow boundaries. For example, if a sphere of light energy is released, it will shine equally bright in all directions. However, if that same energy is squeezed into a cone, then released, the point will be a little brighter than the rounded part. If the energy is flattened to a coin-like disc, the wide, flat bottom and top of the disc will not shine as much, while the edge of the disc will be brighter. If the energy were flattened more until the disc was thinner than the thinnest paper, then very little energy would leave the top and bottom, and the edge of the disc would be bright enough to leave an image of a ring in the eyes after the light was gone. This tendency for energy to leave preferentially through sharp edges leads to many of the more intricate effects that light twisters can produce, such as radiant mechanisms, like objects that dole out energy over time or switch energy release on or off, or thin radiance, like wards, detectors, or canvases. Blending different energies together will also change the effect a light twisting has. The typical example, and easiest to experience, is blending heat and cold energy to stiffen air. Most blends end up like wild energy, without any known uses. However, when used correctly and with the right shapes, there are many blends that produce marvelous effects, such as healing, changing material properties, generating smells and sounds, and much more. Complex light twistings frequently have names. This is a practice particularly prevalent among those who follow dueling, but it's also known within other fields. Healers, crafts, entertainers, just about anywhere where people repeatedly use the same twistings. Many of these names are silly, but it's so much easier to say muscle joining than to say that light twisting that uses 4 twisted needles of wire per cylinder of light driven by 2 units of force mixed with a unit of heat released within a stack of 3 by 2 striations of bioforce bio-cord that grows muscle back, but sometimes causes the muscle fibers to be too long and must only be used when damage appears to have removed, not just damaged, the tissue. The value of naming these twistings becomes even clearer when muscle joining is contrasted with muscle knitting. Most light twisters have an affinity, or a type of energy, with which they excel, and it is usually for light energy, another possible source for the name we've adopted. Here we pause for another bit of history. Humongous Patungus. The most famous of the northern light twisters, Humongous Patungus, had an unbelievably strong affinity for light energy. In fact, so unbelievable are the tales of Humongous Patungus that people still debate the veracity of the accounts of his feats. In one story, he is said to have led an army of thousands to intercept a Nabonid cavalry unit as it rode towards Tupanco, his home city. Wearing the tartan wrap of his clan and his father's scimitar, handle downward, on the belt over his shoulder, he raised his fist to stop the men he led. They filled the valley behind him, trampling the wheat fields of some poor farmers on either side of the road. When the cavalry, armor clinking and chains jangling, clomped to a stop before him, his men hefted their spears, rolled their necks, and every face turned toward the Nabonid captain with silent contempt. The men had so little fear in their eyes, and stood with such determination, that even the captain's armored, war-trained horse danced uneasily and whinnied in fear beneath its rider. The captain, so unnerved by the men and his horse's reaction to them, didn't even treat with Humongous. He simply turned and led his cavalry thundering away. Once they were out of sight, the billowing plumes of dust had settled, and the smell of horses had left the quiescent air. Humongous let the illusion go and wiped the sweat from his brow. The army behind him faded to nothing, and the wheat stood upright again. Humongous breathed a sigh of relief that no light twister had accompanied the cavalry unit. Otherwise, that light twister would have seen tens of thousands of tiny strings of light energy, peppered with mixtures of other energy, being funneled from Humongous' source to the men behind him. In another story, the wedding celebration for the Princess of Tupenko to the Prince of Astring was spoiled before it even started when a whirlwind, screaming through the night before the ceremony, destroyed the wedding decorations and entertainment that had been set in the fields before the palace. The Astring nobility, believing it was a banshee, saw it as a bad omen and were set to call off the wedding and declare Tupenko cursed of the gods. Humongous directed the servants to replace the chairs and drag away everything else. He then twisted light to reproduce the decorations as they had been: velvet roses, fluffy peonies, and elegant calla lilies in beautiful vases demarcated the wedding area from the rest of the garden. Archways with twisting wisteria, draping from trellises just above everyone's reach, swam in the gentlest of breezes. Inviting pavilions, adorned in glimmering fabric, cast shadows of muted colors on the seats where the guests would sit. He even removed the scratches from the musicians' instruments. All seemed right, and the Astring nobility, seeing the miracle the gods had bestowed upon Tupenko, praised the city as blessed above all others. Even with so much destruction still to address in the rest of the city, everyone felt relieved. Except Humongous found the Queen Mother crying within a pavilion he had erected. As a side note to this story, his skill with light was so good that he could perfectly emulate light shining through the various pieces of fabric in the pavilion. Something nearly impossible because it requires forcing the light to preferentially shine out of an apparently flat surface. Great tears rolled down her face. She clenched a huge pile of torn fabric in her hands so tightly her aged knuckles were white. When he asked the queen why she was crying, she explained that the princess's dress had been left in a window overnight for Hust's blessing, and had been shredded by the storm winds. The rags rustled as Humongous took them from the queen and held up what remained of the dress. The fabric felt soft in his hands, and the delicate smell of rosewater lingered in the air around it. He promised he would take care of it. The princess had faith in Humongous, and that night walked to the edge of the light surrounding the ceremony wearing nothing but her shift. When she stepped into the light, she was enrobed in the most exquisite gown anyone had ever seen. The pure white fabric seemed to glow, and beautiful diamonds, pale blue and sparkling in the torchlight, ran the length of the sleeves and bodice, forming the most perfect frame for the elegant necklace that rested on her caramel skin. The crowd watched, enrapt, and the king stared, mouth wide, until Humongous cleared his throat. It's said Humongous held the whole scene for over 3 hours, moving the dress with the princess as she danced through the night, without anyone realizing it was pure light, or noticing that the swishing of the dress always lagged a moment behind. This unforgettable wedding secured the alliance between Astring and Tupenko that holds to this day. As another note on twisting light, we have discussed how releasing bio in a stone will cause no effect, but the principle applies broadly to all energies. Where it gets released will impact the effect it has. This is particularly true of different blends. For example, a specific mixture of energies released in a metal might cause it to be attracted to other metals, like a lodestone. If that same energy is released in anything other than metal, it has no effect. Another blend might cause water to change color, but when released in air, it produces a peculiar odor. Finally, some mixtures only take effect when they are released within another energy. Again, we've said that heat and cold mixed together create stiff air, but more precisely, heat released in cold that is then released creates stiff air. Similarly, cold released in heat that is then released also creates stiff air. Not all mixtures work in both directions, but many do. As you can imagine, the overall effect of energy mixtures, shapes, and the surroundings into which they are released can become immensely complicated. One final comment on these energies. What we have been calling wilds are, in truth, other forms of energy that may one day prove as useful as any of the 5 basic energies we regularly use. But Fully understanding this, and all the effects of light twisting, will require systematic study. There are many light twistings known by individuals that they do not share with the wider community, passing them down only to apprentices within families or bands, or never sharing them with anyone. This is pure selfishness and will hinder the progress that could be available to all light twisters. I would be remiss in my duties if I failed to mention the burden of twisting light. In addition to feeling tired or worn out from twisting light, there is a kind of radiant muscle that runs between your heart and your mind that bears the burden of twisting light. Like all muscles, it strengthens with use, becomes sore with intense use, and can wear out from overuse. You'll soon discover it, a deep pressure on your heart and mind. For many, it's unpleasant at first, but with time it will feel as fundamental to your being as either your head or your heart. You will be able to feel your endurance grow as your ability to bear the burden increases. It will get to the point where you think no more about it than you think about the muscles in your legs when you walk. But, just as your legs feel after running, the burden will ache if you push yourself too far beyond your limit. Conclusion. It has only been within the last 50 years that any systematic effort has been made to analyze, categorize, and record the various effects of light twisting. Prior to that, light twisters were content to operate with the most basic uses of radiant energy and those few light twistings that their mentors taught them. As the instruction of younger light twisters has shifted more towards cadres rather than individual apprentices, the rigor demanded by dozens of minds under instruction has increased dramatically. This has required more than any single light twister, even the most experienced, could provide. The establishment of a small group focused exclusively on research within Freysdal came about a mere 20 years ago, though to this day the vast majority of light twisters know only the basic uses of radiance, and whatever twistings they have learned from their mentors or discovered on their own. Several additional volumes beyond this primer exist or are currently being written that seek to consider the deeper topics of light twisting. If you have found this volume enlightening and wish to contribute to this great project of understanding the wonders of light twisting, please consider joining us. We have covered the basics necessary to begin your training. Be patient with yourself and your teachers. Twisting light competently takes time and perseverance. Keep practicing. Most importantly, guide your younger minds as they develop to avoid joining the sad history of dark light twisters. From the author. Just so we're clear, this is Mike Richards, not Marcus Aurelius. Well, if you've made it this far, let me say I'm impressed. When I created this magic system, I didn't initially think it was all that complicated. Magic comes from rocks. Some people can control it. After writing this, though, I'll gladly confess that it's more complicated than it needs to be, and based on the feedback from the majority of reviewers, not explained well enough in the Peace of Freysdal. Having said all that, I still love it. There's so much potential. This primer was written by a character in-world. He doesn't know about Hereth and the developments that have taken place in Freysdal, so there's still some fundamental principles when it comes to twisting light that are not explained in this primer, but are hinted at in the Peace of Freysdal. People have told me they don't recognize that in the Peace of Freysdal, Hereth is on the verge of initiating a radiant industrial revolution. I'm so excited to work through all the implications of that for the people of Thadrin. I'm also excited to tell so many other stories I've thought of in this world. If you're interested in hearing these other stories too, let me know. I have many other stories set in different worlds that I'm eager to tell, and I'll likely focus on the world that garners the most excitement. Follow me on Instagram at Michael Richards Author and Facebook at Author Michael Richards. Sign up for my newsletter at www.michaelrichardsbooks.com and leave me reviews wherever you can, Goodreads, Amazon, anywhere else, to let me know that you are interested in reading more. Michael Richards. Glossary. 112th Source Trail Cadre, the most disastrous of the Source Trail Cadre, where only 2 of the 24 members survived. Little is known of exactly what happened, as the only two survivors never made a detailed record. The family of several of the deceased took the survivors to court to force a truthful accounting of events. But upon conclusion of the case, all parties involved agreed to destroy the records. The families of the deceased also never shared much beyond that greed and jealousy overtook the cadre. Adalbert, pronounced like like in cat, Dal, Bert, a famous swordsmith known for the king's swords and his role in the salvation of the Toyoksa forges. Adarak Island, pronounced Ad-a-rak. A large island off the east coast of Thadrin, where plants grow at such a fast rate that their growth can be seen. Some claim that the island is getting larger year by year as the plants push out into the ocean, but no rigorous study has yet demonstrated this. Aerolith Basin, pronounced Air-o-lith. A region of Thadrin at the southern end of Grontal Range, where stones, from pebbles to massive boulders, float in the air. Affinity. A tendency for light twisters to have a particular type of energy with which they excel. In the vast majority of light twisters, the affinity is for light energy. Airblade. A simple combat light twisting of cold released in heat, or vice versa, to create solid air. When the energies are shaped with sharp edges, they become air blades. Air blades are invisible once they've been released, though if energy is being funneled to them to sustain them, that energy is visible, though very faint. Air blades are the standard defense against pursuit by speedwalking light twisters. Akilon, pronounced A-ki-lon, one of the founders of the multi-participant dueling conference. Arctic Avalanche, a combat light twisting that creates frozen, solid air that barrels forward, encapsulating, freezing, and smothering anything in its way. Arnold Scravey, pronounced Scray-V, a historical light twister known for many light twistings he developed. Astring, pronounced As-tring, a city in the northern plains. Vladisobak, pronounced Bla-de-so-bak, the northernmost of the major cities. Biosis, the technical name for bio. Blind fish, a light twister sport where the players are blindfolded. Actually, they have an opaque sack over their heads, but we call it a blindfold so we can all feel better about it, and must use their radiant sight to navigate the game. The object of the game is to move an oblong ball, a fish, down a field and place it in the opposite team's goal. The fish has a weak source in it, as do the corners of the goals, so these are visible to players' radiant sight. The players are not allowed to hold sources, so it is difficult to see anything beyond the person holding the fish or players near the goal. K-Rental, pronounced K-Ren-tal, one of the two main orders of light twisters, the other being Falstrechek. K-Rental's distinguishing philosophy is that light twisters are gifted by the gods to serve the rest of humanity. Chain of shifting. As sources are used, they shift to radiate different energies or different qualities of the same energy. Often, they follow a known pattern tied to their origin. Colossal forest. A forest south, east, and north of Tragarthol, with plants and animals that are colossal in size. Cryogenis, pronounced Cry-o-gen-is, the technical name for cold energy. Density, a term used to describe how compressed or diffuse radiant energy is. All light twisters assess density the same, allowing for a uniform quantification system. Detector, a radiant mechanism that creates a detection ward over a small area separate from a light twister. When the ward is breached, the detector releases some sort of signal. Drop. See release. Dragons. Thadrin is home to a variety of creatures that share two common features. First, they are all giants. Second, they all produce radiant effects. Each of these dragons has a stopagium, an organ with sources. Common varieties are fire and ice dragon. Shelled dragons are sighted now and then, while others are attested to but not well known. Dream mist. A combat light twisting that produces a thin cloud which, if inhaled, causes pleasant hallucinations. Some young light twisters use this as a practical joke, or even worse, as a distraction from the challenges inherent to life, but there's evidence that repeated exposure causes weakness, lack of control, and eventual rebellion in the minds. It is a light twisting to avoid. Dueling pit. Official duels are conducted in pits. Originally, these pits were deep, but not terribly wide. Light twisters would fight in the pit to reduce the chances of collateral damage. As the duels shifted from attempts to kill one another to efforts to prove oneself without killing each other, the pits were made wider and shallower, and the job of stopping collateral damage was taken over by saviors. Dueling shell. A specific ward designed to flare in bright colors when it detects deadly light twistings. This is how duelists know when someone has lost a duel. Effects. The results of releasing radiant energy. Energy. See radiant energy. Equatorial ice plains. A vast area bordering Bondargon, lying on the equator, which is covered in a thick sheet of ice year-round despite being surrounded by a hot climate. Fallstrecheck, pronounced fall stray check. One of the two main orders of light twisters, the other being Keirantal. Fallstrecheck's distinguishing philosophy is that light twisters are chosen by the gods to rule over the rest of humanity. Folding. A method for increasing the rate at which a source radiates energy, consisting of collecting energy from a source and then forcing it back into the source. Folding doubles the energy that was released within it. Forge fire. A combat light twisting that releases a directional blast of intense heat over a period of time, as opposed to pure heat energy, which releases omnidirectional heat in a very short period of time. The intensity, duration, and the trigger for when it should be released can all be controlled within the light twisting. Funneling. The process of continuously adding energy to an already extant light twisting in order to sustain it for longer than the effect would exist with only the initial energy used. Giants. Animals that grow to at least twice their normal size. Gorge. An impassable crevice in the land between Bongardon and whatever lies beyond it. Grantel Range, pronounced Gran-tel. A mountain range spanning from the Aerolith Basin near the center of Thadrin to the northeastern coast. Hammer. A combat light twisting that makes everything heavier in a region. Herosudan, pronounced He-ro-su-dan. A pioneering light twister who developed a highly efficient, though incredibly dangerous, streaming technique. Humongous Patungus, pronounced Humangus Petungus. A historical light twister known for his incredible affinity for light energy. Hust, pronounced Hust, like the OO in book or look. God of the harvest. Hust's hammer. A combat light twisting, overhead attack designed to collapse force shields by simultaneously creating an unsustainable draw on the light twister while also making everything in a region tenfold heavier. Once fully formed, it is difficult to stop, and the best defense is to move out of its path. Hust's retribution. Any of several combat light twisting attacks that drain energy from a defense, causing it to collapse. Heldig. God of luck. igniferous, pronounced us, the technical name for heat energy. Laharamark, pronounced la-ha, like the H-A in hat, remark, a historical light twister who developed the modern streaming method. Light ball, a sport played by small teams of light twisters with several balls of unreleased energy. The objective is to get a ball through one of several vertical hoops. Players are restricted to circular areas on the field and must pass the ball from player to player in order to move the ball from the origin to one of the hoops. Light twister, a person who can detect radiance and control energy. Light twisting, a creation composed of radiant energy crafted by a light twister. Lightning spears, a combat light twisting that produces several short lightning pulses. The intensity and length of the pulses can be controlled by the nature of the twisting, but the more intense or the longer the pulse, the more difficult it is to direct. Luminous, pronounced lu-mi-nus, the technical name for light energy. Loyendal, pronounced loy-yen-dal, an annual celebration observed in several areas of Thadrin. What is celebrated differs from region to region, but most celebrations are tied to harvest or to the longest day or night of the year. Madenka, pronounced ma-dain-ke, a group within Falstrachek which teaches that light twisters are not only above non-light twisters, but that we are an altogether different kind of being. Minds. See streams of consciousness. Moonbeam blossom, a generic term for a variety of flowers found throughout Thadrin that have a weak light source in their petals. In the daylight, they look the same as any other flowers, but in the darkness of night, they emit a tiny glow. Muscle joining, a healing light twisting that regenerates muscle tissue, but can sometimes cause the muscle fibers to elongate excessively, so it should only be employed when the damage involves tissue loss rather than mere separation. Muscle knitting, a healing light twisting that reconnects muscle that has been torn or separated without any loss of muscle tissue. Nalika, pronounced na-li-ka, one of the founders of the multi-participant dueling conference. Non-light twister, people who cannot see or control radiant energy. Please note that all children are non-light twisters. Percussive immolation, a combat light twisting that explodes with a loud pop when released and spreads out in a hollow sphere. When it touches something, the sphere bursts like a soapy bubble and envelops the target that was touched, like wrapping them with a sheet covered in flaming pitch. Quality, the relative intensity of the energy emitted by a source. Quantity, a term used in several contexts, including as a descriptor for a piece of energy and as a measure of the amount of energy, such as a small quantity or a large quantity. Radiance, the term used to describe the energy that emanates from sources. Radiant energy, a substance radiated from sources with the capacity to produce an effect. Radiant mechanisms, complex light twistings whose effects sustain a structure that is capable of manipulating radiant energy after it has been released. Radiant sight, the ability light twisters possess to sense sources and energy from a distance, differentiate between types of energy, which most light twisters eventually interpret as color and texture, distinguish shape, and perceive reflections of energy off other objects. Release, the act of a light twister withdrawing the boundary that encapsulated the energy, thus releasing it and triggering the energy's immediate effect. Drop is often used interchangeably, especially when the energy is discharged within a medium other than air. Saviors, in a duel, Saviors stop effects from reaching the audience or one of the contestants, once the dueling shell has been penetrated, of course. This is a crucial but thankless job where success goes unnoticed, but failure can bring infamy. Scoop. The light twisting structure within a streaming construct that diverts unwanted energies. The challenge lies in crafting the scoop to be permeable to the desired energies while blocking all others, a feat of considerable complexity. Shattering darts. A combat light twisting that creates several small projectiles, which upon striking a target, penetrate to a predetermined depth before detonating in small explosions. Shield. A defensive light twisting placed near the light twister or the object to be defended. The most common shield is a simple hollow ellipsoid of force, vectors oriented outward, placed around the body. Shields distinguish themselves from wards by their thickness and proximity to the thing that is being defended. See ward. Shift. The transition of a source from emitting one kind of energy to a different kind, or the same kind of energy with a different quality. Skimming. A process akin to skimming cream from milk or oil from water, used to separate energies, particularly when folding energy back into a source to diminish the presence of wild energies. Source. Anything that emits or radiates energy. Sources are often discussed as if the dominant energy is the only energy the source emits. However, all sources emit multiple energies. Source Trail. A route that traverses several regions of Thadrin, renowned for their powerful sources. The term also refers to a card game mimicking the quest for stronger and stronger sources amid the dangers common to the actual source trail. Source Trail Cadre. In recognition of the perils along the source trail, Keirantal organizes groups of younger light twisters, after they have reached a sufficiently advanced level, to travel the trail together to increase the likelihood of everyone returning safely and with good sources. Specialization. The practice of focusing training on a single kind of energy, shape, or action to increase a mind's proficiency in that area. Speed. A form of light twister racing. Speed walking. Using force energy to move faster than is naturally possible. Streaming. A method used to extract additional energy from a source by channeling energy, once collected from a source, back into either the original source or into a different source, as Herosidon did. Streams of consciousness. Light twisters have the ability to think about, and take action on, many things at once. This ability derives from what feels like separate minds, streams of thought, or streams of consciousness, under their direction. Streams of thought. See above. Strength. How much energy a source radiates over a given period of time, or how much energy a single mind can hold. Storm Lake. A large body of water north of Astring, where great boulders of ice float within a boiling pool beneath an ever-raging cyclone. All of this is a result of the heat and cold sources within the lake. Sunlights. A combat light twisting that produces a blindingly bright, metal-melting hot beam that can penetrate almost all defenses. It is easily seen because of its brightness and is easy to deflect. Sweep. A generic term for a sensory light twisting used to investigate regions that cannot be seen, such as underground or in the water. The feedback from a sweep is akin to tactile sense for your radiant sight. There are several different kinds of sweeps that can be used for detecting a variety of substances or objects. Sweeps and detection words are closely related. Thadrin. The name of the landmass upon which we live. There are some who claim there are other landmasses, but there is no definitive evidence that this is the case. The Trade. The name given to the practice of abandoning your sources when you see another light twister in an area where you cannot be certain of your safety. The basic idea is that you are trading your sources for your anonymity. Once you no longer have your sources, the other light twister cannot easily track you, or distinguish you from non-light twisters. Thin radiance. a set of techniques that yield very thin shapes of radiant energy. Thin radiance is necessary for most advanced light twistings, but is a very hard skill to master. Many light twisters, especially those with only moderate light twisting ability, never do. Toyokusa, pronounced Toy-Yoku-sa, a region in central Thadran, most well known for its metalwork. Tsunamic Rain, a combat light twisting designed to overwhelm static defenses with thousands of tiny strikes coming in a giant wave. It is as if the world's largest swarm of flies transform into metal and use their bodies as battering rams. Tupenko, pronounced Tu-Pain-Ko, a city at the mouth of a bay in northern central Thadran. Unit, a measurement for quantities of radiant energy. A single density quantity of energy the size of an average man's fist is 1 unit. Vector, the sense of the direction in which force energy, or many mixtures of energy as well, will act when it is released. Viaticus, pronounced Vi-a-ti-cus, the technical name for force energy. Ward, any of a wide number of protective light twistings that light twisters set at some distance from themselves. Because most use thin radiance techniques, they are very difficult to make and are mostly just used for detection. Wild energy, a term used to describe the energy emitted when energy from one form is released within a source of a different kind of energy. Wild energies, frequently simply referred to as wilds, usually have an unpredictable effect, though there is some ongoing research into cataloging the most common wilds and their effects. This concludes the reading of A Primer on Twisting Light by Michael Richards. Read to you by me. I'm Michael Richards. And if you've made it this far, again, very impressive. I hope you enjoyed as I tried to get better at audiobook reading, but didn't. Maybe someday I'll do this again, but more likely than not, if there's ever a valuable thing for me to have as an audiobook, I will just hire someone else to do it for me. Thanks. Hope you enjoyed. Oh, and don't forget to do everything I said in my author's note, like go and sign up for my newsletter and follow me on Instagram and leave me reviews everywhere you can so that I know you want to hear more from me. Or not hear more from me because I'm not going to do more audiobooks, but, read more from me, so I'll keep writing. Anyway, again, thanks. Bye.